for the launch of Military History Supremo, Essays in Honour of David Horner, hosted by the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. I'm Associate Professor Garth Pratton, one of SDSC's historians and also one of the editors of the book. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land on which we gather tonight, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their leaders past and present. I'd also like to welcome tonight the Secretary of the Department of Defence and SDSC alumnus, Mr. Greg Moriarty, the Deputy Chief of Army, Major General Chris Smith, and the Dean of the College of Asian Pacific, Professor Helen Sullivan. Tonight's events are part of a grand tradition in SDSC. Military History Supremo is the 7th festive volume produced to honour one of our greats with a collection of original scholarship inspired by their work. The first was Coral Bell's Nation, Region and Context, Studies in Peace and War, published in 1995 to honour our founder and inaugural head, T.B. Miller. It was followed by volumes recognising the academic and policy contributions of Coral Bell herself, Des Ball, Paul Dibb and Bob O'Neill. Just recently, Secretary Moriarty launched Strategic Imagination, honouring the late Brendan Sargent. Tonight, it is the turn of Professor Emeritus David Horner. Our title for this volume is taken from David's biography of long-serving Secretary of the Department of Defence, Sir Frederick Shedd, Defence Supremo. The Cambridge Dictionary defines Supremo as the person in charge of an organisation or who is considered to have most skill and authority in a particular type of activity. It is an apt characterisation for David. While not literally in charge of Australian military history as a discipline or a profession, David is one of Australia's leading practitioners and advocates of it. His knowledge and experience command significant authority. His approach is widely emulated, and few who undertake any serious research in the field can do so without consulting his work. David truly deserves the appellation of a soldier scholar, having served for 25 years in the Australian Regular Army, including in operational deployment to South Vietnam. And his scholarship is thus underpinned by deep and authentic knowledge of the requirements and challenges of employing the military force. He has been the official historian of Australian peacekeeping, humanitarian and post-Cold War operations and the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. In terms of the sheer scale of his publications, running to 19 sole-authored books, 19 co-authored and edited volumes, and over 100 articles, chapters, reports and reference works entries, David has few peers in the Australian historical profession. And still he keeps writing. His latest book on Australian generalship in the Second World War is due out in the new year, and a companion volume on generalship in the Great War is well underway. When I interviewed David for the book, I asked if he had ever thought of stopping to do something else, like gardening or playing golf. His response: I have been interested in this subject as a discipline and as a hobby all my life. I just can't see myself stopping. But the characterisation of David as a Supremo of Australian military history rests on more than just prodigious scholarship. Throughout his career, he has devoted himself to establishing and developing this field as a subject of serious academic study in Australia. To be sure, David was not the first Australian soldier to write history, nor was he the first historian to carry military subjects into the Australian Academy. However, he was part of a vanguard launched by the Faculty of Military Studies at Duntroon that advanced the study of strategy, operations and command as a legitimate area for academic study in Australia, and aspired to stimulate further study in these areas. David realised, however, that developing an academic discipline, one that didn't exist before, was a task that could not be done alone. His contribution is thus extended to include the roles of generous colleague, thoughtful mentor, and meticulous editor of others' work. I am but one of the many gathered here tonight who have benefited from David's continuing interest and support, and I dedicate my work on this book to him as a sincere and deeply felt thank you. The fact that I was but 5 when David's first book, Crisis of Command, was released also shows the longevity of his efforts to regenerate our discipline through mentoring successive generations of historians. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Professor Emeritus Joan Beaumont, my friend, colleague and co-editor, to talk a little bit more about David. She has known him for just a bit longer than myself.
I'm not quite sure whether to thank you for that introduction, Guy. But thank you to our distinguished visitors and to all of you for coming. I'm conscious, when I think back to the time when I first met David, that, and I said this afternoon, that he and I have been in the academic profession so long that we're almost historical artefacts in our own right. We can remember things that today's generation simply cannot understand, which is what it's like to write a PhD without a laptop, when every correction requires a typist to retype the whole manuscript, when you were not allowed in the archives to use anything but pencil on those terrible little cards we used to have. And I remember flying from London to Australia with my PhD all in the shoebox under my feet, full of cards with my indecipherable handwriting on it. Now, this does lead me to the story of David Horner. When I first met David Horner, we were considerably younger. Was it 1977, do you think, David? And the then Public Record Office, now the National Archives of the United Kingdom, had moved out to this rather bleak site in Kew, which did give them a lot more accommodation, which was much less accessible than previous archives had been, and which involved some pretty dreadful experiences of waiting for the London tube on very cold railway stations. But one of the worst things about the archives at that stage, as I said, was that you were meant to note everything, either on an old typewriter or by hand. And there were, of course, no digital cameras. So what you had to do if you couldn't be bothered noting it was to order photocopies at an astronomical price. Was it £1 a page? It was something absurd. But we would, nonetheless, because we were there from Australia, resort to this absurd expenditure. And there on the queue, waiting for our photocopies, I met this man. And it was a long queue, so we started talking, and we started exchanging information about our research. And this must have been just when Crisis and Command was coming out. And I've never told this story, but David said to me, he said, it's coming out with A&D Press. I thought, oh, poor David, he's got an Australian publisher. Such was the cultural cringe at that stage. I actually had a British publisher for my PhD, but that British publisher went bankrupt one day. A&D Press, I'm pleased to say, is still going and has been the publisher of this volume. So we had a good talk and we kind of kept in touch. But thereafter, to some degree, our paths went separate ways, and David, I have to say, went on to publish many more books than I did. As I think is already mentioned, you're on number 38, I think it is, at the moment. But David and I, apart from bumping into each other in some archive, either in Australia or in Britain, finally, I think, really got to work together again when I was a rather desperate Dean of Arts at Deakin University, in times of government stringency, yes, that happened before today. And I wrote to David and I said, look, I really want to get back into academic life. Can you find me a niche at ANU? And he said, oh yes, come up here and we'll give you a 3-month fellowship. I arrived, I think, coughing in one of the worst colds that I probably gave to you immediately over our lunch at Boffin's. But it was my way of re-energising my own academic career. And I mention that because, as we've already heard, not only is David an extraordinarily prodigious author in his own realm of scholarship, but in many ways, I think his greatest contribution to the discipline has been his care for other scholars. In my own case, he read all of Broken Nation in manuscript, pointed out all the egregious errors about tactics and operations and other things that I've been too tired to notice. But while I was here in the fellowship that he arranged for me at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, where I eventually found my academic home at ANU, I joined in a kind of visitor faculty capacity, I suppose you call it, the official history team. That is the team that was writing the official history that's got such a long name that I can hardly remember, Peacekeeping et al. And David, as we heard today, when the authors were talking to each other, had a fortnightly meeting of all the members of that team, to which I was invited, where chapters were submitted, including his own, and everybody debated the draft chapters. And then after the often very rigorous critique, they would retire to one or other of the drinking oases around the campus. And that to me was an exemplar of David's capacity to nurture and really encourage and help develop the younger generation of scholars. And Garth mentioned very briefly, one of the things that I've been in awe of in David has been his willingness to read other people's manuscripts. You used to do it when you were with the Army History Committee, I remember, and manuscripts that were frankly absolutely unpublishable were through his hard work given the capacity to be given the light of day. Just my final comment would be, in conceptualising this fellowship, I was very influenced by a more European tradition of writing books that honour senior fellows in our field. And having been a dean for much longer than I'd like to have been, I have to say academics can be a bit querulous, to put it politely. And I think our capacity to honour and to pay tribute to leading scholars amongst ourselves is something that we really need to nurture. Somebody said today, well, you know, why didn't we do this in the book and rather as opposed to that? Lectures traditionally are written collectively by people who feel they owe something to the scholar that we are honouring, either, in my case, through friendship and collegiality, or because they've been a PhD student or have worked on a research team. So the authors were, everybody owes, in some ways, some of their academic and professional experience to David's mentoring, but also the idea of a fellowship is you write chapters which illustrate the way in which your own research has developed and in some sense has flowered because of the influence of the scholar in question. So of course we hope you'll read the Festschrift, but it is really a tribute to this extraordinary scholar, David Horner.
Now up to invite the Deputy Chief of Army, Major General Chris Smith, to speak to us in the
All right, might I point out that I think Garth and I are about the same age, so I feel somewhat awkward being the guy, you know, to launch the book, but I'll do it justice. So I think it was about almost 35 years ago I began an engineering degree at ADFA. I think within a few weeks it was a science degree, and then I think almost by the middle of the year exams I was an artist like most other eventual infantrymen. It wasn't so much that I was doing badly at the science subjects, but the truth is I was. But probably more so, I discovered a passion for history. Now at that time, the ADFA history department included historians of the calibre of Peter Dennis, Robin Pryor, and of course Geoffrey Gray. And I think Bob Hall was also working at ADFA at the time too, not in the history department, but those individuals inspired me, and I ended up doing a history double major. And of course the flavour of history at ADFA at the time was military history, and I loved it, obviously. But there was another name at the time that meant a lot to me too, and of course it was David Horner. Before I'd even joined the Army, I bought a copy of Duty First, Royal Australian Regiment in War and Peace, which of course was edited by David, and I treasured it. I read it from cover to cover very quickly, and then I reread bits of it over and over again for years, particularly as a young officer cadet at ADFA. And I think the idea of being part of the history of the Royal Australian Regiment particularly inspired me. To some extent it overwhelmed me, and even after I'd eventually joined the regiment, I doubted whether I was worthy of those who'd gone before me. And I think the point here is that history certainly teaches humility. Now, I still have the books. I brought some props along. I pulled it off the shelf last night, and I note that it still has the price tag on it. And the only thing I could read was that it comes from, I don't know how many here are familiar with Launceston and the City Mall, but it comes from the Birchall's bookstore, which would have been familiar to everybody for a long period of time. Unfortunately, it's not there anymore. But while the price tag has faded, the effect of the book on me has not. By the time I bought the book, David already authored Crisis of Command, High Command and SAS Phantoms of the Jungle. And in fact, shortly after starting at ADFA, I had a second-hand book of David's, which of course is Crisis of Command. And it also still sits on my bookshelf. Now, David would eventually become the inaugural commanding officer of the Land Warfare Study Centre in 1998. I was by that time a young captain, and needless to say, I lapped up its products too. And to be honest with you, I didn't appreciate that it was so young in 1998. I had some sense that the Land Warfare Study Centre had been around for a long time. Now, in those early years at the centre, it was people like Mike Evans, Greg DeSoma, Alan Ryan, who wrote fairly prodigiously for working papers and monographs and so on. However, despite his early influence on me, I wouldn't meet David for the first time until 2020. And in fact, we didn't really meet because it was COVID, and we met because we were both members of the Army Battle Honours Committee. We would eventually meet in person, but the thing, as he pointed out earlier, was that it turned out we were very like-minded. And I think the particular thing we were like-minded on was this sense in the committee, and it has pervaded the Army over, I suppose, recent decades, is that we're fighting against that sense of presentism, that sense of a historical disconnect, and we were fighting to make sure we held on to a standard of battle honours that didn't deny what those who had gone before us had done. And anyway, I think that was quite profound, and it means a lot, even if it was only a few years ago. Now, the point of that story is simply to amplify the point of the book that we're launching today, which is that David has had an extraordinary influence on generations of Australians, whether they be army officers, professional military historians, or anyone fortunate enough to have picked up any of David's books. The publicity materials for this launch begin with the assertion Professor Emeritus David Horner, AM, is one of Australia's greatest military historians. And the title of the book is Military History Supremo. But even in this age of hyperbole, I don't think anyone here, except maybe David himself, would think either the title or the publicity material to be exaggerations. David is the sole author, as Garth mentioned, of 19 books, co-author of 19 edited volumes, and the author of over 100 articles, chapters, reports and the like. As David mentioned, he was at the vanguard of establishing strategy, operations and command as legitimate fields of academic study in this country. And while he's best known for his work on high command, his work covers a much broader range of topics. And of course, so does the book, and I suppose it's appropriate that I should hold it up, because this is what we're here to launch. Military History Supremo. Now, the book reflects, I think, both of these things. Its broad range of subjects reflects the depth of David's writing, and the diversity and the quality of the authors reflects the extent of David's influence. Military History Supremo is indeed a festschrift. The essays by colleagues and students honour David's professional life, I think, very suitably. Now, the book has 6 parts, and I think it's appropriate in launching it that I touch on them very briefly. The first part reflects on the practice of writing about Australian military history and the role of the soldier scholar in Australian historiography. David, of course, served in the Australian Army for over 3 decades, finishing his career as a colonel and having served with 3 RAR in South Vietnam. And in this first part, Garth, sorry, where are you, Garth? Sorry. Garth explores the convergence of David's military and academic careers, and Craig Stockings examines David's achievements as an official historian. The second part of the book addresses strategy and high command. Joan explores the psychology of strategic decision-making with a study of the psychology that led to the catastrophe of the so-called bird forces of 1941-42. And Jean Bow and Hugh White round out the section with reflections on the reasons Australia goes to war and the risks of Australia's continued faith in alliances. The third theme is command and commanders. Peter Stanley applies David's method to a study of Sir Charles Napier, and Chris Roberts looks into the nature of command by examining the command of Lieutenant General Sir Harold Walker. The fourth theme of the book is coalition warfare. Stephen Paget examines interoperability through the Australian experience, and Rhys Crawley and Garth again describe how in 2009 some key personalities overcame the absence of a campaign mindset in southern Afghanistan. The fifth part of the book explores intelligence. Richard Frank examines Allied code breaking in the Pacific War, and John Blackston looks at the legacies of the Venona decrypts for Australian intelligence and security arrangements today. The sixth and final section of the book is on changing environments, and in this section Tristan Moss looks at the history of the ADF in space, Peter Lundy asks whether soldiers make good peacekeepers, and Bob Breen proposes an Australian solution for dealing with grey zone threats. All the contributions are outstanding, but I might just draw out a few examples to illustrate the value and the importance of the work to make the point. I think Garth Pratton's and Craig Stocking's essays are excellent. I think they're important because they give us a sense of David beyond just his work. We see in those the earnest cadet under-officer in his school cadet unit, the outstanding history student at Duntroon who was encouraged just to relax a little bit. We see the serious, studious and systematic PhD candidate. We see the hard-working official historian dealing with the highly fraught matter of writing official histories. We see a decisive and considerate leader of men at war with, and might I add, a lifelong appreciation for the value of tanks and artillery in close quarter battle. But we also see a soldier scholar who, as Garth observes, carried his own service quite lightly. And Garth reminds us that David has never used his work for instrumental purposes nor for public advocacy. He's always written to inform, not to instruct, and his method, much like the man, was strongly empirical, pragmatic and humble. He wrote for the general public, not for academics, and he eschewed theoretical engagement and abstraction. Now, I also found Joan's study of Gulf Wars particularly poignant. It's probably no surprise to anybody that forward posture and its connection to deterrence has been a particularly marked point of discussion and consideration in Russell, if not the Pentagon and Honolulu. I think Joan's work offers an important caution. Irrationality, whatever its cause, can easily infuse decision-making. And I think the risks today are similar to those of 1941 and early 1942. And ignorance about the relative utility of certain forward-postured forces if war were to break out. Overly favourable assumptions about what foreign governments might allow those forces to do or how they might support them. I think perhaps too much confidence in what we think a potential adversary might do in the event of a war, and a degree of over-abstraction and theorising that disconnects the idea of forward posture from its practicalities. So what Joan's essay does, which is true for the rest of the volume, I think, is point to the great value of the study of history for both military professionals and for defence policymakers. As they say, history might not repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And if I just add a little bit of weight to that point, just indulge me, this particular concern has caused the Chief of the Army, Simon Stewart, to reinvest heavily into the professional education of Army officers. Not only has he published a study guide containing mandatory reading, he's initiated work to establish a new degree at ADFA, a Bachelor of War Studies, to rectify a weakness in Army officers' understanding of war and warfare. And the point is that David Horner's influence is certainly a factor in that initiative, which is a point that he made last year when we had a small dinner at Duntroon to recognise David's contribution over many years to the Army. Importantly, military history is to be the foundation of the course syllabus. And need to say Craig Stockings is doing a lot of the work to establish that degree. Now, I also enjoyed Chris Roberts' essay because I have a strong personal interest in the idea there is an immutable nature of command. So Chris makes clear that command is a very human and personal thing at a time when military professionals worldwide have become enamoured by the idea that technology provides a better answer to command. I think the idea that advanced computing can make command better can only exist in an environment in which abstraction holds sway over empiricism of historical cases as a bulwark against fanciful or overly abstracted thinking. Again, we see here the influence of David and the importance of an empirical bias for military officers. So in short, I think the volume certainly engaged me, and I'm sure it will engage many more readers both here and abroad. So can I finish by thanking and congratulating everybody involved in the project. Firstly, thank you to the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre and ANU for making the book possible. Thank you for the authors for your fine contributions, and thank you to Joan and to Garth for pulling it all together and editing such an important and informative volume. But of course, most of all, thank you, Professor Emeritus David Horner, for inspiring the work and for inspiring us all. And can I just add a comment that I thought I should put down that Joan mentioned when we were talking at the very beginning of the evening. She said, so many of us owe our careers to David because he is such a generous scholar, and I think that's a fitting way to launch this book. To that end, it's my privilege to launch the book, Military History Supremo, so thank you very much.
David, it's your chance to say a few words.
Thank you, General Smith, very much for your kind words and for launching the book. It's a little bit embarrassing to stand here because I didn't actually have to do anything for the book. I think perhaps my name's on it just to somehow give it some... Anyway, the point I'd like to make, though, is that it's not just about me. It's about military history as a discipline. And I think this is a celebration of military history as an academic discipline, something that is not just worthwhile in the university, but useful for the whole community. Now, if you go in a bookshop, you'll see hundreds of books there if you go over a period about military history. But most of them are what we might call secondary books. People who have written books about some battle or some incident, but they've drawn on other books. And it's the job of the academic historian to break new ground, to have new views. And we were talking this afternoon about the fact that well, these books might sell quite well. Don't you get a bit annoyed about it? Yeah, no, I don't get annoyed about it. It's the job of an academic who's paid by the community to get information out to the community. And that's what an academic book is about. And I think that's what we're celebrating here today. Yes, it's partly about me, but it's bigger than that. It's about military history matters to do with strategy, command. The Defence of Australia studied carefully in the universities and published to reach a wider audience. So again, thank you very much for your words, and thank you to the two editors and to all the other contributors. I very much enjoyed reading the chapters and learned a few things along the way myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy Smith, for your words tonight and for doing us the honour of launching the book. I'd also, on behalf of myself and Joan, like to publicly thank our team of authors for their contributions and their patience and good humour through the book's bumpy road to publication. Thank you also to the team at AMU Press for producing such an attractive volume. If you'd like one, there's a limited number of copies for sale out near the flags in the foyer. But if there is none left, there is also these cards that have a QR code on the back that takes you through the AMU website, so the AMU Press website, and there's also a discount code that will get you 20% off. Also, my very sincere thanks to Tracy and Kian, who worked their usual no-fuss magic to make all this happen. So thank you very much to them. And to all of you, our audience, thanks for turning out on a Friday night to mark this special occasion with the team who put the book together, and David. Thank you very much.